You have exactly 10 minutes to remove your belongings, Mrs. Higgins, or I call the police. Those were the words that ended 30 years of a woman's life on a sidewalk. Martha Higgins, 80 years old, watched a stranger change the locks on the only home she had left. No warning that mattered. No mercy that counted. Just a clipboard, a locksmith, and a man who smiled while he destroyed her. Before we go further, if you're watching this, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. And if stories like this move you, subscribe because what happens next will change everything you think you know about justice. The morning had started like every other morning of Martha Higgins's life. For the past 3 decades, slow, quiet, and full of small rituals that only she seemed to notice anymore. She woke at 6:15, same as always, because her body had never learned to sleep past the hour her husband used to leave for the mill. Even though Walter had been gone for 11 years now, some habits didn't die with the people who created them. She made her coffee in the same chipped blue mug, sat in the same chair by the window, and watched the same maple tree drop its leaves onto Sycamore Street the way it had every autumn since 1994. She didn't know as she sipped that coffee that this would be the last morning she would ever spend in that apartment. At 9:40, there was a knock on her door. Sharp, official, nothing like the friendly taps her neighbor Doris gave when she wanted to borrow sugar or complain about her knees. Martha opened the door in her housecoat, her silver hair still pinned back from the night before, and found a man in a gray suit standing in her hallway, holding a leather folder against his chest like a shield. "Mrs. Higgins," the man said, his voice smooth in the way that expensive shoes are smooth, polished. Cold, built for walking over people without leaving a mark. "Richard Caldwell, Regional Property Manager for Oakleaf Management. May I come in?" Martha blinked at him. "Is something wrong with the building?" "May I come in?" Richard repeated, and this time it wasn't a question. She stepped aside because that was what you did when you were 80 and alone and a man in a suit told you to move. She had spent her whole life being polite to men who didn't deserve it, and 80 years hadn't cured her of the habit. Richard walked into her living room and looked around the way an inspector looks at a used car he's already decided not to buy. His eyes moved over the photographs on the wall, Walter in his army uniform, their wedding day, their son, Daniel, as a boy, on this very street riding a bicycle that no longer existed anywhere, except in that faded photograph. "Mrs. Higgins, I'll get straight to the point," Richard said, opening his folder. "Our system shows your rent account is delinquent. 3 months. That's a violation of your lease agreement, and unfortunately that gives us grounds for immediate termination of tenancy." Martha felt something cold slide down the back of her neck. "That's not possible," she said. "I pay every month. I've paid every month for 30 years. I set it up on the automatic payment just like you people told me to when you switched everything to that computer system last year. The portal shows otherwise." "Then the portal is wrong." Richard's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "The portal doesn't make mistakes, Mrs. Higgins." "Well, somebody did," Martha said. And for a moment, the old fire that had once made her a force to be reckoned with, the fire that had raised a son alone, after Walter's heart gave out, the fire that had once stared down a factory foreman twice her size and made him apologize to a terrified 16-year-old boy, that fire flickered behind her eyes. But Richard didn't see fire. He saw an old woman in a housecoat, and old women in housecoats didn't frighten him. Nothing frightened him. Fear required imagination, and Richard Caldwell had spent 15 years training himself out of imagining what happened to the people on the other side of his eviction notices. "I'll need you to vacate the premises by end of day," he said, sliding a paper across her coffee table. "This is the official notice. A locksmith has already been scheduled for 4 o'clock. Martha stared at the paper like it was written in a language she didn't speak. "Today," she whispered. "You're telling me I have to leave today?" "The locksmith is scheduled for 4. Richard repeated, checking his watch, as though the number itself was more interesting than the woman in front of him. "I'd recommend you start packing." "I have nowhere to go." "That's not really our department, Mrs. Higgins." Something in Martha's chest cracked, quiet and total, like ice breaking under weight that had been building for years without anyone noticing. She looked at this stranger, this smooth, cold stranger who held her entire life in a leather folder, and she understood in that instant that he had already made his decision long before he knocked on her door. This conversation was not a conversation, it was a formality. A box to check before the machine moved forward and crushed whatever was standing in its way. Please, she said, and hated herself for the way her voice cracked on the word. There has to be a mistake. Let me call the bank. Let me show you my statements. I have proof I paid. You'll have time to appeal through corporate channels, Richard said, already standing, already buttoning his jacket, already halfway out the door in his mind. But that process typically takes 6 to 8 weeks, and I'm not authorized to delay the eviction while it's pending. 6 to 8 weeks. Where am I supposed to live for 6 to 8 weeks? Richard paused at the door. For 1/2 of 1 second, something almost human flickered behind his eyes, the ghost of a person he might have been in another life, one where he hadn't spent a decade and a half learning that empathy was inefficient. Then it passed the way weather passes, and his face went smooth again. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, he said in a tone that suggested he was sorry for nothing at all. 4 o'clock, Mrs. Higgins. And then he was gone, and Martha Higgins was alone in the apartment she had lived in for 30 years, holding an eviction notice with hands that had gone numb sometime in the last 5 minutes without her noticing. She called the bank first. That took 40 minutes on hold, and when a representative finally answered, she learned that yes, her payment had gone through every single month, and yes, there was a record of it, and yes, she could absolutely send proof, but no, the representative could not contact Oakleaf management directly, and yes, Martha would need to handle that herself. She called Oakleaf's corporate office next. She was transferred 4 times. She explained her situation 4 times to 4 different voices that all sounded like they were reading from the exact same script. On the 4th call, a young man named Kevin, barely older than her grandson would have been, if she'd had a grandson, told her not unkindly that the portal migration last spring caused some processing delays. And unfortunately, those cases have to go through a manual review that isn't handled at the eviction stage. So you're telling me it might actually be your mistake, Martha said. It's possible, ma'am. I really am sorry, but there's nothing I can do from where I'm sitting. Then who can? You'd need to speak to the regional office. Mr. Caldwell handles the regional office. Martha closed her eyes. Of course he did. By 1 o'clock, she had made 11 phone calls and accomplished nothing except confirming what she already knew in her bones, that the machine that ran her life had made an error, and that the machine had no mechanism for admitting it, and that somewhere between a broken computer system and a man who didn't care, an 80-year-old widow, was about to lose her home. She sat down at her kitchen table, the same table where she had once helped Daniel with his math homework, the same table where 31 years earlier she had fed a terrified, starving 16-year-old boy who wasn't hers but who ate like he hadn't seen a full meal in weeks. And for the first time all morning, Martha Higgins allowed herself to cry. Not for long. She didn't have long. The clock on the wall read 1:17, and the locksmith was coming at 4. Doris Kellerman knocked at 2 o'clock, alerted by the moving truck idling outside that had nothing to do with Martha and everything to do with a coincidence that made the entire situation feel even crueler. A young couple moving into the building 2 doors down, laughing, carrying boxes labeled kitchen and bedroom in cheerful marker, while inside apartment 2B, an old woman packed 30 years of memory into whatever cardboard she could scavenge from the recycling bin. Martha, honey, what in God's name is going on? Doris asked, standing in the doorway in her bathrobe, 82 years old herself, and moving slower than she used to, but sharp enough to see disaster when it walked into the building. They're evicting me, Martha said, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that the paper hadn't. They say I'm behind on rent. I'm not behind on rent, Doris. I've never been behind on rent in 30 years. Well, tell them that. I did. Nobody will listen. The locksmith comes at 4. Doris's mouth fell open. 4 o'clock today? Martha, that's not even legal. They can't just... I don't know what's legal anymore, Martha said quietly. I called 11 people today. 11. Not one of them could stop it. Not one of them would even try. Doris stood in the doorway wringing her hands, and Martha watched something painful cross her old friend's face, the specific helplessness of a woman who wanted desperately to fight, but had no weapon left to fight with. Doris was 82. Her husband was dead. Her children lived 3 states away and rarely called. She had no lawyer, no money, no leverage against a corporation with 15 floors of glass and steel downtown. I'll help you pack, Doris finally said, because it was the only thing she had left to offer. They packed in near silence after that, moving through the apartment room by room, and every box Martha filled felt like a small burial. The photographs came down from the walls, first Walter in uniform. Walter and Martha on their wedding day, Daniel as a baby, Daniel as a boy, Daniel's graduation, and then the photograph that made Martha's hands shake as she wrapped it in a dish towel. A photograph of a skinny 16-year-old boy standing awkwardly in her kitchen, arms too thin, eyes too old for his face, a photograph taken 31 years ago on the only day he had ever agreed to let her use a camera. "Who's this?" Dorrit asked, glancing at the photo before Martha tucked it safely into a box. "A boy I used to know," Martha said softly. "A long time ago." She didn't elaborate. There wasn't time, and some stories weren't meant for casual telling. Anyway, some stories live quietly in a person's chest, waiting for the moment they were needed. At 3:45, the locksmith's van pulled up outside. At 3:50, Richard Caldwell arrived in a black sedan that looked far too expensive for a man whose job was throwing old women out of their homes. And he stood on the sidewalk checking his phone while the locksmith unloaded his tools with the casual efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times before and would do it 100 times again. Martha stood in her doorway, surrounded by cardboard boxes that contained everything she owned, and watched a stranger prepare to erase 30 years of her life in the time it took to drill out a deadbolt. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, walking toward him with what dignity she had left, "please, I'm begging you, give me until tomorrow. Give me until I can reach someone who can help. I have nowhere to go tonight." Richard looked up from his phone with the mild irritation of a man being interrupted during something important, though the something important was clearly nothing more than checking a sports score. "Mrs. Higgins, I understand this is difficult." "You don't understand anything," Martha said, and her voice cracked. Not with weakness, but with something closer to fury, the kind of fury that only comes from being wronged by someone who refuses to even look at the wrong they've done. "You don't understand what it means to lose everything in one afternoon because a computer made a mistake and nobody bothered to check. You don't understand what it's like to be 80 years old and have nowhere to sleep tonight." For a moment, Richard actually stopped checking his phone. He looked at her, really looked for the first time all day, and something crossed his face that might have been the very last trace of a conscience buried under 15 years of quarterly reports and performance bonuses. Then his phone buzzed. A text from his regional director. "Numbers looking good this quarter, Rich. Keep it up." And whatever had almost surfaced in his face sank right back down where it came from. "The locksmith needs to proceed," Richard said, turning away from her arm. "I really am sorry for the inconvenience." The word inconvenience landed on Martha like a slap. 30 years of her life, and the man responsible for ending it couldn't find a bigger word than inconvenience. By 4:15, the deadbolt on apartment 2B had been changed. By 4:30, Martha's boxes sat on the sidewalk in a small, sad pile, and the young couple 2 doors down had finished unloading their moving truck, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded feet from their own beginning. By 5 o'clock, the sun had started its slow autumn descent, painting the sky the color of a bruise, and Martha Higgins sat on the curb beside everything she owned, watching her building her home, her life, her 30 years from the outside for the first time. No neighbors came out to help, beyond Doris, who stood beside her, wringing her hands, apologizing over and over for a crime she hadn't committed. No system intervened, no lawyer materialized. The world simply kept moving around her cars, passing people walking their dogs, the young couple's laughter drifting faintly through an open window that used to be someone else's window, someone else's life, someone else's home. Martha sat very still. She was too tired to cry anymore, too tired to be angry. She simply sat there in the fading light, an 80-year-old woman with nowhere to go, feeling for the first time in her long life truly and completely invisible. And that was when Doris asked the question that would change everything. "Martha," she said quietly, sitting down beside her on the curb despite her aching hip, "isn't there anyone you can call, family, old friends, anyone at all?" Martha stared out at the street for a long moment, and something stirred in the deepest, oldest part of her memory, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years, attached to a boy she hadn't seen since he was 16 years old, and running from a life that no child should ever have to run from. "There's someone," she said slowly, "but I haven't spoken to him in 30 years. I don't even know if the number still works." "Well," Doris said, handing her the flip phone from her purse, the only phone either of them owned because neither woman had ever bothered updating to something smarter. "It's worth a try, isn't it? What's the worst that happens?" Martha looked down at the phone in her trembling hands. 30 years was a long time. People changed. People forgot. People moved on and built lives that no longer had room for the past. But she remembered his face the day he'd left her kitchen for the last time, thin and scared, but standing straighter than he had when he arrived. And she remembered what he'd said to her on her porch steps, words she had carried in her heart for 3 decades without ever expecting to need them. If you ever need anything, Miss Martha, anything at all, you call me. I don't care where I am or what I'm doing. You call me and I'll come. She had laughed it off at the time, a sweet, earnest promise from a broken boy who had nothing to offer but gratitude. She never imagined she would test it. With hands that shook from more than just the cold, Martha Higgins dialed a number she hadn't used in 30 years and held her breath. The phone rang twice. "Yeah, who's this?" A man's voice answered, deep and rough, carrying the particular gravel of someone who had spent decades speaking over engine noise. Martha's throat closed for a moment. Then she found her voice small and trembling in a way she hated. "Tommy? Tommy Graham, this is Martha Higgins. I don't know if you remember me. It's been so many years, and I'm sorry to bother you. I just didn't know who else to." There was a pause on the line, a long, heavy pause that made Martha's stomach drop, certain she had made a terrible mistake, certain that whoever Tommy Graham had become in 30 years had no room left for an old woman's desperate phone call. Then the voice on the other end changed completely. "Miss Martha." The gravel was still there, but something underneath it had cracked wide open. Something raw and immediate and utterly unguarded. "Miss Martha, is that really you?" "It's me, Tommy." Jesus. A long exhale like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying for a long time. "Jesus, Miss Martha, it's been God. It's been 30 years. I think about you all the time. You know that. I think about that kitchen table. I think about—" He stopped himself. "What's wrong? Something's wrong. I can hear it in your voice." Martha closed her eyes. Doris sat beside her, watching, gripping her hand tightly. "They evicted me, Tommy," Martha said, and the words tumbled out now, 30 years of composure cracking under the weight of the day. 30 years I lived in that apartment. 30 years I never missed a payment. And today a man came to my door and told me I had until 4 o'clock. And I called everyone I could think of, and nobody would listen. And now I'm sitting on the sidewalk with everything I own in cardboard boxes, and I have nowhere to go tonight. And I didn't know who else to call. "I'm so sorry to bother you after all these years. Miss Martha." Tommy's voice cut through her spiraling words, calm and absolute, carrying an authority that hadn't existed in the frightened 16-year-old boy she remembered. "Stop apologizing. Right now. You hear me?" Martha stopped. "You called me," Tommy said. "That's exactly what you were supposed to do. That's exactly what I told you to do 30 years ago, and I meant every word of it then, and I mean it now." His voice dropped quiet and fierce. "Where are you sitting right now?" "On the curb, outside my building. Well outside what used to be my building." "You stay right there," Tommy said. "You don't move. You don't go anywhere. You understand me?" "Tommy, I don't want to be any trouble. I just needed to hear a friendly voice. I didn't mean for you to—" "Miss Martha." His voice cracked just slightly, 30 years of gratitude compressed into 2 words. "You saved my life. You understand that you saved my life back when nobody else in this whole world gave a damn whether I lived or died. I was 16 years old and starving and running from a man who used to put cigarettes out on my arm, and you let me into your kitchen and you fed me, and you never once asked me for anything in return. You gave me the only kindness I had in that entire year. I don't forget things like that. I don't care if it's been 30 years or 300. You are family. You hear me, family." Martha pressed her free hand over her mouth, tears finally coming hot and unstoppable. "You stay right where you are," Tommy said again. And now there was something moving in the background of the call, the sound of a door, footsteps, other voices asking questions. "I'm coming, Miss Martha, and I'm not coming alone." The line went dead. Martha sat on the curb, phone still pressed to her ear, staring at nothing, uncertain whether what she just heard was real or some exhausted hallucination brought on by the worst day of her life. "Well," Doris asked, "what did he say?" Martha lowered the phone slowly, her hands still shaking, her heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in years, something that felt dangerously, impossibly like hope. "He said he's coming," she whispered. "He said he's not coming alone."
Nothing.
40 miles away in a warehouse on the industrial edge of town, Tommy Graham stood in the center of a room full of steel and grease and 30 years of brotherhood, holding a phone that suddenly felt like the heaviest object he had ever carried in his life. Around him, the Hells Angels Riverside chapter went about their Saturday afternoon exactly as they always did. Wrenches turning engines being tuned, laughter echoing off corrugated metal walls, the ordinary rhythm of men who had built a family out of leather and chrome and loyalty that ran deeper than blood. But something in Tommy's stillness cut through all of it. One by one, conversations died. Wrenches stopped turning. Men who had known Tommy Graham for decades, men who had ridden beside him through funerals and celebrations and the darkest nights of their lives, recognized the particular quality of his silence, the way his shoulders had gone rigid, the way his jaw had tightened into something that promised trouble for whoever had put that look on his face. Big Sal, the club's sergeant at arms, a mountain of a man with forearms like tree trunks and a heart that most people never got to see, was the first to speak. "Prez," he said carefully. "You good?" Tommy didn't answer right away. He was staring at the phone in his hand like it had just delivered news of a death. And in a way, it had the death of the last 30 years of comfortable distance he'd kept between his current life and the debt he'd carried since he was 16 years old. "You remember," Tommy said slowly, looking up at his club, "when I told you all about the woman who saved my life?" The warehouse went completely silent. Every man there had heard the story. Tommy told it every year, at every anniversary, at every moment when the club needed reminding of why they existed, why they had built this brotherhood in the first place. The story of a woman named Martha Higgins, who had found a broken, starving, 16-year-old boy hiding behind her house one freezing October night, and instead of calling the police or turning him away, had brought him inside and fed him and let him sleep on her couch for 3 weeks until he was strong enough to run far enough that his father could never find him again. "She's on a sidewalk right now," Tommy said, his voice low and dangerous, "sitting on top of everything she owns because some property manager threw her out of her home over a computer error. 80 years old, 30 years of perfect rent history, and they gave her until 4 o'clock this afternoon." The silence in the warehouse changed texture from attentive to furious, a room full of hardened men feeling the specific righteous rage that comes from hearing an innocent person harmed by someone who should have known better. "She called me," Tommy said. "After 30 years, Miss Martha called me. Not because she wanted revenge. Not because she wanted anything from me at all. She called because she had nowhere else to turn, and even after 30 years, she remembered that I told her I'd come if she ever needed me." Big Sal cracked his knuckles, a sound like gravel shifting. "So what are we doing about it, Prez?" Tommy looked around the warehouse at 40 men who had built their entire lives around one unbreakable principle. Family protects family, and family didn't require blood to be real. "We're going to get her," Tommy said. "We're going to get her boxes. And then every single one of us is going to ride to that property management office and remind them exactly what happens when you throw an innocent woman out onto the street like she's garbage." Nobody moved for exactly 1 second. Then as one, the warehouse exploded into motion, men grabbing jackets, checking bikes, calling out logistics, the entire chapter transforming in an instant from a Saturday afternoon of routine maintenance into something with the focused, terrible purpose of a storm gathering strength before it breaks. Tommy grabbed his own jacket off the hook by the door, the leather worn soft from 30 years of wear, the patches on the back telling the story of a life he had built out of nothing but grit and loyalty and the memory of one woman's kindness on the worst night of his childhood. "Miss Martha," he said quietly to himself, zipping up the jacket, "you're not sitting on that curb one more minute than you have to." Across town, in an office on the 15th floor of a glass tower that smelled like money and looked like power, Richard Caldwell sat behind his desk with a satisfied smile stretched across his face, reviewing the day's numbers on his monitor. Unit 2B terminated. Vacancy filled within 48 hours. Q3 occupancy targets exceeded. He leaned back in his chair, already composing the email he would send to his regional director, already imagining the bonus that would land in his account at the end of the quarter, already forgetting the name, Martha Higgins, entirely filing her away in the same mental drawer where he kept every other person he had ever removed from a property. Not as a human being, but as a line item, resolved a problem, eliminated a number, improved. He had no idea as he sat there congratulating himself on a job well done, that 40 motorcycles were already rolling out of a warehouse across town. He had no idea that his afternoon of quiet celebration was about to be interrupted by a sound he would remember for the rest of his life. He had no idea that the woman he dismissed as an inconvenience had just called in a debt 30 years in the making, a debt that was about to arrive at his front door with the force of 100 engines and the unshakable fury of a family that did not forgive and did not forget and was not under any circumstances going to let this go unanswered. Richard Caldwell finished his email, hit send, and smiled at his reflection in the darkened monitor. Somewhere far below, his glass tower on a sidewalk that meant nothing to him and everything to an old woman with nowhere left to go. Martha Higgins wiped her eyes, held Doris's hand, and waited. She didn't know exactly what was coming, but for the first time all day, she wasn't afraid. The sound reached Sycamore Street before the bikes did. It started as something Martha almost mistook for thunder, a low rumble rolling in from somewhere beyond the rooftops, steady and building, the kind of sound that made the windows of parked cars tremble faintly in their frames. Doris felt it first, gripping Martha's hand tighter, her eyes darting toward the end of the block. "Martha," she whispered, "do you hear that?" Martha lifted her head. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, her body exhausted in that particular way that comes from having nothing left to fight with. But the sound pulled her out of her own despair inch by inch until she was sitting up straight on the curb, staring down the street with something flickering behind her tired eyes. The rumble grew louder, deeper. It stopped sounding like thunder and started sounding like something alive, a heartbeat made of steel and gasoline, growing closer with every second until the first headlight appeared at the far end of Sycamore Street, and then another, and then a dozen more, spreading out across the road in perfect formation, like a wave gathering height before it broke. The young couple, who had been carrying boxes into their new apartment, stopped mid-stride, staring. A man walking his dog froze on the sidewalk, the leash slack in his hand. Somewhere behind a curtain, an elderly resident who hadn't come outside all day pressed her face against the glass to see what in God's name was happening to her quiet street. 40 motorcycles rolled down Sycamore Street in tight, disciplined formation, chrome catching the last orange light of the afternoon sun, leather vests marked with patches that told the story of a brotherhood most of these onlookers had only ever seen in movies. At the front of the formation rode a man with silver-streaked hair and a jaw set like granite, his eyes scanning the block until they found exactly what he was looking for: an old woman sitting on a pile of cardboard boxes, her hand clutched tightly in the hand of another old woman beside her. Tommy Graham raised his fist, and 40 engines cut off in near-perfect unison. The silence that followed was almost louder than the engines had been. For a moment, nobody on Sycamore Street moved. Nobody spoke. 40 men sat on their bikes in total stillness, and one woman sat on the curb staring at the man climbing off the lead motorcycle, removing his helmet, revealing a face that had aged 30 years since she'd last seen it, but that still carried underneath the lines, in the gray, in the hardness that life had carved into it, the exact same eyes she remembered from a terrified 16-year-old boy standing in her kitchen doorway. "Miss Martha," Tommy said, his voice cracking as he walked toward her. Martha rose from the curb slower than she wanted to, her knees protesting after hours of sitting, but she didn't care about her knees. She didn't care about anything except closing the distance between herself and the boy she hadn't seen in 30 years. The boy who was now a man built like a mountain, tattoos, climbing both forearms, a leather vest heavy with patches, but who dropped to his knees in front of her the second he reached her, taking both of her frail hands in his. "Look at you," Martha whispered, her voice breaking completely now. "Look at what you became. Look at what you let me become," Tommy said. And for a man who commanded 40 riders with a single raised fist, his voice was shaking like a child's. "I wouldn't be anything if it wasn't for you, Miss Martha. I wouldn't be alive." Doris stood a few feet back, her hand pressed over her mouth, watching this reunion unfold with tears sliding freely down her weathered cheeks. She didn't understand the full story yet, not really, but she understood enough. She understood that whatever debt existed between this old woman and this leather-clad stranger ran deeper than anything she had words for. "I'm so sorry to have called you," Martha said, gripping Tommy's hands like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. "I know you have your own life now, your own responsibilities. I didn't mean to pull you into my mess. I just..." "Stop." Tommy's voice came out sharper than he intended, and he softened it immediately, but the word hung firm in the air. "Miss Martha, I need you to understand something right now, and I need you to really hear me. There is nothing in this world more important to me today than being right here, right now with you. You are not a burden. You are not a mess. You are the reason I'm alive to have a life at all." Behind him, Big Sal climbed off his own bike and approached slowly, removing his helmet, revealing a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite by decades of hard living, but that softened the moment his eyes landed on Martha. "Ma'am," he said, his enormous frame folding into an oddly gentle bow. "Sal Marino. Tommy's told us about you for 30 years. It's an honor." Martha stared up at this mountain of a man, utterly overwhelmed. "You've heard about me." "Ma'am, every man in this club has heard about you," Sal said. "Every anniversary of the club, every time a new brother gets patched in, Tommy tells your story. You're kind of a legend around here." Martha let out a small, disbelieving laugh through her tears. "I just fed a hungry boy some soup." "You did a hell of a lot more than that," Tommy said, standing now, still holding one of her hands like he couldn't bring himself to let go. "You want to know what actually happened that night, Miss Martha? Because I don't think you ever really knew the whole truth." Martha looked at him confused. "What do you mean I remember exactly what happened?" Tommy's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he'd arrived, the warmth in his eyes gave way to something darker. Something that had been buried for 30 years and was finally clawing its way to the surface. "My old man was going to kill me that night," Tommy said quietly. "Not metaphorically, Miss Martha, not he was rough with me or he had a temper. I mean, he had his hands around my throat 2 hours before I ended up in your backyard, and I genuinely believed in that moment that I was going to die in that house. I got out through a window. I ran until my legs gave out. And I ended up collapsed behind your fence because it was the closest place I could find that wasn't a street corner where he'd find me in 10 minutes. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. In 30 years, she had never known this. She had known he was running from something bad. She had never known how close it had come to killing him. "You found me there?" Tommy continued, his voice rough, half frozen, bleeding from where I'd cut my arm climbing through the window glass, and you didn't call the police. You didn't call anyone. You just opened your back door and said, 'Come inside before you catch your death.' Like I was some stray cat that wandered onto your porch instead of a bruised, terrified kid who probably looked like trouble to anyone with sense. You fed me. You bandaged my arm. You gave me your son's old clothes. And you never once asked me a single question I didn't want to answer. You were a child," Martha whispered. "A child in pain. What kind of person would I have been to turn you away?" "Most people would have," Tommy said flatly. "Most people did before you. I'd knocked on 3 other doors that night. 3. Every single one of them looked at me and saw trouble, saw a mess they didn't want in their lives, and shut the door in my face. You were the only person in this entire city who looked at a broken kid and saw a human being worth saving." The street had gone almost completely silent except for the soft creak of leather as 40 bikers stood listening, many of them for the first time, hearing the full, unedited truth behind the legend they'd repeated at every club meeting for years. "I stayed with you 3 weeks, Tommy said. 3 weeks, and you never asked me for anything. Not money, not chores. I couldn't handle nothing. And when I finally got strong enough, when I finally had a place to go, my uncle out west, the only family member who wasn't scared of my father, you drove me to the bus station yourself. You bought my ticket, you put $40 in my pocket that I know for a fact you couldn't afford to lose, and you told me," his voice broke completely now, 30 years of gratitude finally overflowing in front of 40 of his brothers and one exhausted, grieving old woman. "You told me I mattered," Tommy finished. "You were the first person in my entire life who ever told me that and meant it." Martha reached up and cupped his face in both her hands the way she had when he was 16 and crying at her kitchen table, terrified of a future he couldn't see past. "You matter," she said now, just as she'd said then. "You have always mattered, Tommy Graham. And look at you. Look at the man you built out of nothing but that boy's broken pieces." Sal cleared his throat, wiping at his own eyes with the back of a tattooed hand, pretending it was dust from the road. Around them, several other riders were doing the same, hardened men who had seen violence and loss and every ugly thing life could offer undone completely by the sight of their president kneeling in front of an 80-year-old widow on a sidewalk full of cardboard boxes. "All right," Tommy said, finally standing up straight, wiping his own face with the back of his sleeve, his voice hardening back into the authority that had brought 40 men here in the first place. "Enough of that. We've got work to do." He turned to face the small mountain of boxes stacked haphazardly along the curb, and something in his expression shifted from grief into pure focused fury. "This is everything you own?" he asked. "That's it," Martha said quietly. 30 years and that's what's left. Tommy's fists clenched at his sides. He looked at the building behind her, the building where a locksmith's drill marks were still visible on a freshly changed deadbolt. The building where some corporate machine had decided an 80-year-old woman's home meant nothing more than a line on a spreadsheet. "Sal," Tommy said, "get 4 guys load up her things in the truck. Careful with the boxes. Everything gets treated like it's made of glass. You understand me?" "On it, Prez," Sal said, already turning to bark orders at the nearest riders. "Wait," Martha's voice cut through the activity, small but firm. "Tommy, where am I supposed to put all this? I don't have anywhere to go. That's the whole problem." Tommy turned back to her and something in his face softened again, though the fire underneath never fully disappeared. "You're staying with me tonight," he said. "No arguments. I've got a guest room that's been empty for years and it's about damn time it got some use. Tomorrow we figure out the rest. But tonight you sleep somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere nobody can change the locks on you." Martha's eyes welled up again. "Tommy, I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask," Tommy said. "I'm telling you, that's how this works now." Doris, who had been standing quietly to the side through this entire exchange, finally found her voice. "Young man," she said, addressing Tommy directly for the first time, "I don't know who you are exactly, but I want you to know that this woman has been the best neighbor I've ever had in my entire life. And if there is anything at all that needs doing to fix this mess, I want to help." Tommy looked at her and something like respect flickered across his weathered face. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Doris Kellerman." "Well, Doris Kellerman, thank you for standing by her today when nobody else would." He extended a hand and Doris shook it, feeling suddenly strangely like she was shaking hands with something far bigger than a single man. "You're welcome to ride along if you want to see how this story ends." Doris blinked. "Ride along on one of those?" She eyed the motorcycles with something between terror and fascination. "We've got a truck for the boxes," Tommy said, a faint smile finally cracking through his hardened expression. "You can ride in that if the bikes aren't your speed." "I think that would be for the best," Doris said, though a small, giddy part of her, a part she hadn't felt in decades, wished she was brave enough to say yes to the motorcycle instead. While Sal's men loaded boxes with a gentleness that surprised every onlooker still gathered on the sidewalk, Tommy pulled Martha aside, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Miss Martha, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. This man, Caldwell, the one who did this to you—" Tommy's voice had gone flat and cold, the voice of a man calculating something dangerous. "Tell me exactly what he said to you. Every word you can remember." Martha hesitated, sensing the weight behind the question. "Tommy, what are you planning?" "I'm planning on making sure this never happens to you again," Tommy said. "And I'm planning on making sure it never happens to anyone else that man decides is too inconvenient to matter. But I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with first. Tell me what he said." So Martha told him. She told him about the portal error, about calling 11 different people and getting nowhere about Richard's cold recitation of policy, while she begged him for one more day, about the word inconvenience landing on her like a physical blow. She told him about the locksmith arriving on schedule, about the young couple moving in 2 doors down while her entire life sat in the boxes on the sidewalk, about the specific, deliberate cruelty of a system built to process human beings like defective inventory. With every word, Tommy's expression hardened further, until by the time she finished, his jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. 30 years of perfect payments, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. 30 years and they threw you out over a computer glitch they wouldn't even bother to check. "I don't want trouble, Tommy," Martha said, suddenly afraid of what she saw building behind his eyes. "I don't want anyone getting hurt because of me." "Nobody's getting hurt," Tommy said, and something in the way he said it made Martha unsure whether to believe him. "Nobody's laying a hand on anybody, but that man is going to understand tonight exactly what he did, and he's going to fix it. How he works for a whole corporation, Tommy. He's not going to just change his mind because 40 Hells Angels are standing outside his office." Tommy finished, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something almost like a smile touched his lips, dark, satisfied, dangerous. You'd be surprised how quickly a man's priorities shift when the entire structure of what he thought was safe starts feeling a whole lot less safe. Martha searched his face, uncertain. "You're not going to do anything illegal, are you?" "Miss Martha," Tommy said, placing a hand gently on her shoulder, "in 30 years have I ever once given you a reason not to trust me?" She thought about it, thought about the phone call, the immediate response, the way he dropped to his knees on a public sidewalk in front of 40 of his own men without a shred of embarrassment, and shook her head slowly. "No," she admitted, "you haven't." "Then trust me now," Tommy said. "This isn't about revenge. This is about making sure a man who thinks he can throw an 80-year-old woman onto the street without consequences learns real quick that consequences exist." Behind them, a police cruiser had pulled up at the far end of the block, drawn by a neighbor's nervous 911 call about a gang descending on the street. A young officer stepped out cautiously, one hand resting near his belt, eyeing the sea of leather and chrome with obvious tension. "Afternoon, folks," the officer called out, approaching with careful, measured steps. "Got a call about some kind of disturbance. Everything all right here?" Several bikers turned toward him, and for a moment the air went tight with the particular kind of tension that exists whenever uniforms and outlaw patches occupy the same space. But Tommy stepped forward immediately, his hands visible, his posture calm and open. "Evening, officer," Tommy said. "No disturbance here. We're just helping a friend move some belongings. This is her building." He gestured toward Martha. She was evicted this afternoon over what looks like a billing error on the property manager's end. We're helping her relocate her things. The officer's eyes moved to Martha, taking in her age, her exhaustion, the pile of boxes still being loaded, and something in his professional wariness softened slightly. "That true, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes, officer," Martha said. 30 years I lived here. Never missed a payment. They still put me out on the street this afternoon." The officer's jaw tightened, an expression that suggested he'd seen this particular kind of injustice before and hadn't liked it any of those times either. "You have paperwork, proof of payment." "I have bank statements," Martha said. "The bank confirmed the payments went through. Nobody at the management company would listen." The officer glanced back at the building, then at the 40 motorcycles lined up along the curb, then finally at Tommy, sizing him up with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with plenty of clubs before and knew the difference between trouble and something else entirely. "You planning on causing any trouble tonight?" the officer asked directly. "No trouble," Tommy said evenly. "We're going to go have a conversation with the property management company about correcting their mistake. That's all. Nobody's touching anybody. Nobody's breaking anything. We're just going to stand outside their office and make sure they understand this isn't something they get to sweep under the rug." The officer studied him for a long moment. Then unexpectedly, something like understanding passed across his face. "My grandmother got evicted once," he said quietly. "Similar story. Paperwork error nobody wanted to fix. She ended up in a shelter for 2 weeks before it got sorted out." He looked at Martha, something gentler in his eyes now. "I'm sorry that happened to you, ma'am." "Thank you, officer," Martha said softly. "I can't officially condone whatever you all are planning," the officer said, looking back at Tommy. "But I also didn't see anything here except a bunch of people helping an old woman move her things. As far as I'm concerned, that's all this was." He tipped his hat slightly. "You folks have a good evening." He walked back to his cruiser, and Tommy watched him go with something like grim satisfaction. "See," he said to Martha, "even the law knows what's right when it's standing in front of them plain as day. It's the corporations that forget." 20 minutes later, every box had been loaded into the truck with a level of care that would have surprised anyone who judged these men purely on their appearance. Doris sat up front in the passenger seat, still slightly stunned by the entire afternoon, clutching her purse like it was the only normal object left in a world that had turned strange and enormous around her. Martha stood beside Tommy's motorcycle, staring at it with obvious apprehension. "I haven't been on one of these since I was 19 years old, she admitted. "Walter used to have a little Triumph before we got married. I rode on the back of that thing exactly twice before his mother made him sell it." "Well," Tommy said, handing her a spare helmet, "tonight you're riding on the back of mine. That all right with you?" Martha looked at the helmet, then at the bike, then at the sea of leather-clad men waiting patiently around her, and something in her chest, something that had felt dead and defeated only an hour earlier, flickered back to life. "Walter always said I was too stubborn to be scared of anything," she said, taking the helmet with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "Let's find out if he was right." Tommy grinned a real grin, wide and unguarded, the first one Martha had seen from him since he'd arrived. "That's the spirit, Miss Martha." He helped her onto the back of the bike, showing her where to hold on, checking twice that her helmet was secure, treating her with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the raw power of the machine beneath them. "Ready, Bea?" he asked. "Ready," Martha said, though her heart was pounding in a way that felt for the first time all day less like fear and more like something dangerously close to exhilaration. Tommy raised his fist into the air. 40 engines roared to life in perfect thunderous unison, the sound rolling down Sycamore Street like an approaching storm finally breaking free. Neighbors who had gathered on porches and behind windows watched in stunned silence as the convoy pulled away. Martha Higgins riding at the very center of it, an 80-year-old widow wrapped in the protection of 40 outlaws, who had built an entire brotherhood on the principle that family didn't require blood, only loyalty. As they rode, Martha felt the wind pull at the edges of her coat, felt the vibration of the engine beneath her, felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. The sensation of being protected completely and without condition by people who had absolutely nothing to gain from helping her, except the simple, uncomplicated satisfaction of doing what was right. Across town in the 15th floor office of Oakleaf Property Management, Richard Caldwell's phone buzzed with a pound from his assistant Jennifer, who worked the front desk 2 floors below his private office. "Mr. Caldwell, you should probably come look at this. Something weird going on outside." Richard frowned at the message, mildly annoyed at the interruption to his evening review of quarterly projections. He typed back a quick reply. Weird how the response came almost instantly. "There's like a huge group of motorcycles. Bikers. A lot of them. They're not doing anything yet, just parking outside the building." Richard rolled his eyes, already composing a dismissive response in his head. Probably some rally, some charity ride, nothing to do with him. His day had gone exactly as planned. Vacancy resolved, numbers improved, another quarterly target within reach. He wasn't about to let a group of bored bikers ruin his evening. Probably just passing through. Locked the front doors at 6 like usual. Not our problem. He hit send, leaned back in his leather chair, and returned his attention to his monitor. Utterly unaware that the group of bikers currently gathering outside his building included the very woman he had evicted that afternoon, riding on the back of a motorcycle belonging to a man who had spent 30 years waiting for the chance to repay a debt that Richard Caldwell didn't even know existed. Jennifer, 2 floors below, stared out the lobby window with growing unease as more and more motorcycles arrived, filling the street outside the building with a wall of chrome and leather that showed no signs of leaving. She counted at least 30 bikes already, and more were still turning the corner, forming into rows with a precision that felt less like a random gathering and more like a deliberate, coordinated arrival. She picked up the phone again, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed Richard's extension. "Mr. Caldwell," she said when he picked up, her voice tighter than before. "I really think you should come down here. This doesn't look like people passing through. This looks like they're waiting for something. Hang." Richard sighed, irritation creeping into his voice. "Jennifer, it's Saturday evening. I have work to finish. I'm sure it's nothing." "There's easily 40 of them now," Jennifer said. "And Mr. Caldwell, I think I recognize one of the women getting off the trucks. I think that might be the tenant from this morning. The eviction on Sycamore Street." Richard's fingers froze over his keyboard. "What did you say, the eviction from this morning?" Jennifer repeated. "The elderly woman, I think she's out there. With them." For the first time all day, something cold slid down Richard Caldwell's spine, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Not since his earliest days in the industry, when the human cost of his onion had still occasionally managed to reach him before he'd built enough armor to keep it out. "That's not possible," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he found himself standing, walking toward his office window, looking down at the street 15 floors below. What he saw stole the breath from his lungs. 40 motorcycles arranged in perfect, disciplined rows completely surrounding the front entrance of Oakleaf Property Management. Riders standing beside their bikes, arms crossed, faces set in expressions of grim, patient purpose. And at the very center of the formation, illuminated by the last orange light of the setting sun, an old woman being helped down from the back of a motorcycle by a silver-haired man whose face, even from 15 floors up, radiated an intensity that made Richard's stomach drop. "Oh, God," Richard whispered. "Mr. Caldwell," Jennifer's voice crackled through the phone, small and frightened. "What do you want me to do?" Richard stood frozen at his window. Watching the woman he had dismissed that morning as nothing more than a line item, an inconvenience, a problem efficiently resolved, standing now at the center of a small army that had materialized specifically because of what he had done to her. "Lock the doors," Richard said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lock every door in the building. Now." "Mr. Caldwell, I don't think locked doors are going to—" "Just do it, Jennifer." He hung up the phone with hands that had begun for the first time in 15 years of a career built entirely on cold efficiency to shake. Outside, Martha stood on solid ground for the first time since the ride began, her legs wobbly from the unfamiliar journey, her heart pounding, from something that felt equal parts terror and vindication. She looked up at the glass tower rising above her, the building that housed the machine that had destroyed her home in a single afternoon, and felt Tommy's steady hand settle on her shoulder. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Martha admitted. "I've never seen anything like this in my whole life." "Nobody in that building has either," Tommy said, his eyes fixed on the glass tower with an expression that had gone completely coldly focused. That's rather the point. Around them, Sal was organizing the men into their final formation, a silent, disciplined arrangement that required no shouted orders, only glances and gestures perfected over years of riding together. Doris climbed carefully out of the truck, staring up at the building with weird, nervous eyes. "Martha," she whispered, "are we really doing this? Are we really about to confront a whole corporation?" "I don't know what we're doing," Martha admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "But I trust him, Doris. I trust him with everything I have left." Tommy turned to face his Club 40 men standing in perfect silence, waiting for his signal, waiting for the word that would determine exactly how this confrontation would unfold. He looked at each of them in turn, men who had ridden through blizzards for charity toy runs, men who had stood vigil outside funeral homes to shield grieving families from protesters, men who had built their entire identity around a code of loyalty that outsiders never understood and insiders never questioned. "Nobody touches anybody tonight," Tommy said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent street. "Nobody raises a fist. Nobody says a word that isn't the truth. We are not here to scare anyone into submission. We are here to make sure that man up there understands in a way he cannot possibly ignore exactly what he did today and exactly what he is going to do to fix it." He paused, his eyes drifting up to the glass tower, to the 15th floor, where a shadow had appeared briefly in one of the windows before vanishing just as quickly. "He thinks he's safe up there," Tommy said quietly. "He thinks glass and height and a corporate title make him untouchable. Tonight, he's going to learn something different. He's going to learn that no amount of glass protects you from the truth when it finally comes looking for you." Martha stood beside him, gripping his arm, watching the building she had never once visited in 30 years of paying rent through an automated portal that had somehow impossibly broken the one thing it was supposed to protect. Above them, behind darkened glass on the 15th floor, Richard Caldwell stood frozen at his window, watching 40 motorcycles and one old woman stare up at his building with an intensity that made his carefully constructed world of numbers and quotas and quarterly bonuses feel for the first time in 15 years, dangerously, irreversibly fragile. He reached for his phone with trembling hands and dialed the only number he could think of. His regional director, the man who had congratulated him just hours earlier for a job well done. The call rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Richard stood alone in his 15th floor office, the silence outside more terrifying than any noise could have been, and understood with a dawning horror that settled into his stomach like a stone that whatever was about to happen next, there was nobody left to call, nobody left to hide behind, and absolutely nowhere left to run. Jennifer's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone twice before she managed to lock the lobby doors. Through the glass, she could see the formation outside growing more still, more patient, more terrifying in its silence than any shouting crowd could have been. She backed away from the entrance, retreating toward the elevator bank, when the sound of the glass doors rattling stopped her cold. Someone was trying the handle, not forcing it, not pounding on it, just trying it calmly the way a person tries a door they fully expect to open. Jennifer peered through the glass and found herself looking directly into the eyes of the silver-haired man who had climbed off the lead motorcycle. He wasn't angry. He wasn't threatening. He simply stood there, patient as stone, looking at her the way a man looks at an obstacle he knows is temporary. "Ma'am," Tommy said, his voice carrying clearly through the glass, "I'm not here to cause you any trouble. I just need 5 minutes with Richard Caldwell. That's all. 5 minutes and then we're gone. Jennifer swallowed hard. Mr. Caldwell said to lock the doors. I understand that, Tommy said, still calm, still infuriatingly patient. But you and I both know locking a door doesn't fix what happened this morning. It just delays the conversation that has to happen eventually. He paused, his eyes softening slightly. You know Martha Higgins, don't you? You've probably seen her come through this lobby 100 times over the years. To drop off paperwork, ask questions, say hello. Jennifer's throat tightened. She did know Martha. Sweet Mrs. Higgins, who always brought a small tin of cookies around the holidays for the front desk staff, who always asked about Jennifer's kids by name, who had never once in all the years Jennifer had worked there caused a single problem for anyone. She's out there, Tommy said quietly, sitting in that truck right now because she has nowhere else to go tonight, because your boss decided a computer error was more important than 30 years of a woman's life. Jennifer's eyes welled up before she could stop them. I told him it looked wrong, she whispered. I told him this morning when I pulled up her file that the payment history looked fine to me. He told me it wasn't my department. It's nobody's department, is it? Tommy said, something bitter creeping into his voice. That's exactly the problem. Behind him, Martha approached, slowly walking with Doris's steady arm supporting her until she stood close enough to the glass for Jennifer to recognize her fully. Mrs. Higgins. Jennifer breathed, her hand flying to the door lock, almost against her own will. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I tried to tell him, I really did. I know you did, sweetheart, Martha said gently through the glass. I know this isn't your fault. Jennifer's fingers hovered over the lock mechanism, torn between her explicit instructions and the plain, undeniable wrongness sitting in her chest. She looked at the small army of motorcycles behind Tommy, at the calm authority in his eyes, at the old woman she had known for years, standing exhausted and displaced on the sidewalk, and made her decision. The lock clicked. 5 minutes, Jennifer said, pulling the door open, just enough for Tommy to step through. That's all I can give you. If security shows up, I had nothing to do with this. 5 minutes is all I need, Tommy said, stepping into the lobby, his boots echoing against the polished marble floor. He turned back briefly, looking at Martha through the open door. Wait here, this part I do alone. Tommy, Martha started to worry, flooding her voice. I'm not going to hurt him, Miss Martha, Tommy said, reading the fear in her eyes immediately. I promise you that. I'm just going to make him understand something he's never had to understand before. Martha nodded slowly, though her stomach twisted with an anxiety she couldn't fully name. Sal stepped up beside her, his enormous frame a comforting presence in the fading evening light. He'll be all right, ma'am, Sal said quietly. Tommy's never broken a promise in the 15 years I've known him. If he says he's not going to hurt the man, then the man's walking out of this with all his teeth intact. Might not walk out with his pride, though. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt to Tommy like the longest 30 seconds of his adult life. 30 years of gratitude and helplessness, compressed into a small mirrored box rising through a building built on the exact kind of cold efficiency that had almost gotten him killed as a teenager and had decades later tried to destroy the one person who had ever shown him a different way to live. He caught his own reflection in the elevator mirror. Silver hair, weathered face, leather vest, heavy with 30 years of earned patches, and thought about the terrified 16-year-old boy who used to look nothing like this, who used to flinch at raised voices, who used to believe that the world was fundamentally divided into people who hurt you and people who didn't care enough to stop it. Martha had taught him there was a third category, people who saw you, really saw you, and chose kindness even when it cost them something. The elevator doors opened onto the 15th floor, and Tommy stepped out into a hallway lined with framed awards and corporate mission statements about community and integrity that made his jaw clench with every word he passed. Richard Caldwell's office door was closed. Tommy didn't bother knocking. He pushed it open and found Richard standing at his window, phone pressed to his ear, his back to the door, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. I don't know how they found the address. I need someone from corporate security down here immediately. This is completely... He's not coming, Tommy said calmly. Richard spun around so fast he nearly dropped his phone. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other. Richard in his expensive suit, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear he was failing to hide. Tommy standing in the doorway in worn leather, radiating a stillness far more unsettling than any shouting could have been. Who? Richard started, his voice cracking. How did you get up here? Security is supposed to. Your receptionist let me up, Tommy said, stepping fully into the office and closing the door behind him with a soft, deliberate click that landed in the room like a gunshot. She's a good woman, knows the difference between right and wrong, even when her boss doesn't. Richard's hand tightened around his phone. I don't know who you are, but you need to leave right now or I'm calling the police. Go ahead, Tommy said, gesturing toward the phone in Richard's hand. Call them. Tell them exactly what happened. Tell them you evicted an 80-year-old widow this afternoon over a payment portal error that your own bank confirmed wasn't her fault, and now you're worried about a man standing in your office asking you to fix it. I'm sure they'll be very sympathetic to your side of the story. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced at his phone, then at Tommy, calculating something behind his frightened eyes. That eviction was processed according to protocol, Richard said, his voice regaining a fraction of its earlier coldness, the same corporate armor he wore like a second skin. Mrs. Higgins was 3 months delinquent, according to our system. Your system is wrong. Tommy said, his voice still calm, still level, but carrying an edge now that made Richard take an involuntary step back toward his desk. You know it's wrong. Your own receptionist knew it was wrong this morning and told you so. You chose not to listen because listening would have meant slowing down, and slowing down would have meant missing whatever quarterly number you were chasing. That's not, Richard started. Don't, Tommy said, and something in that single word cut through Richard's protest like a blade. Don't stand there and lie to me about protocol and process. I've spent my whole life around men who hide behind rules to justify hurting people they've decided don't matter. I know exactly what that looks like. I grew up with a father who used discipline as an excuse for abuse, and I built my entire life avoiding men just like him. You're cut from the same cloth, Mr. Caldwell. You just wear a nicer suit. Richard's face flushed in anger, finally breaking through his fear. You have no idea what you're talking about. I have a job to do. I have targets to hit, a company to answer to. You think I enjoy this? You think I wake up every morning excited to evict people? I think you stopped caring whether you enjoyed it a long time ago, Tommy said. I think somewhere along the way you decided it was easier to see people as numbers than to actually look at what you were doing to them. And today that decision cost an 80-year-old woman her home of 30 years. I can't just reverse an eviction because a group of bikers showed up outside my building, Richard said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier conviction. There are legal processes. There's paperwork. There's a woman sitting in a truck outside your building right now with everything she owns in cardboard boxes, Tommy said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. There's a woman who fed me when I was starving, who bandaged my arm when I was bleeding, who saved my life when I was 16 years old and running from a man very much like the one currently standing in front of me, hiding behind rules and paperwork. And you're going to tell me about legal processes. Richard's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the sea of motorcycles below, and something in his throat bobbed nervously. What exactly are you planning to do here? He asked quietly. Are you threatening me? No, Tommy said. I'm educating you. There's a difference. He walked slowly toward Richard's desk, his boots heavy against the expensive carpet, and placed both hands flat on the polished wood, leaning forward until Richard had no choice but to meet his eyes directly. You made a mistake today. Not a paperwork mistake, a moral one. You looked at a woman who trusted your system for 30 years, and instead of double-checking a discrepancy that your own employee flagged as suspicious, you chose the fast path, the easy path, the path that let you hit your numbers without slowing down, to consider the human being on the other end of your decision. The system flagged her account, Richard said weakly. I followed the process. You followed the process because the process was faster than being human, Tommy said. And now 40 men are parked outside your building, and I am standing in your office, and you have exactly one choice to make tonight. You can keep hiding behind protocol, keep pretending this was just business, keep telling yourself you did nothing wrong, and you can find out exactly how patient 40 men can be when they're standing outside a building all night, all week. However long it takes for the story of what you did to reach every news outlet, every review site, every potential tenant who searches your company's name online. Richard's face went pale. Or, Tommy continued, straightening up slightly, you can do the right thing, right now. Tonight. Reverse the eviction, restore her lease, waive whatever fake penalties your system generated. and guarantee in writing that nothing like this ever happens to her again for as long as she lives in that building. Richard stared at him for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through calculations that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with damage control. You're talking about extortion. I'm talking about consequences, Tommy said. There's a difference between that too. If I reverse this, my regional director is going to ask questions. This affects my performance numbers, Your numbers, Tommy's voice rose for the first time sharp and incredulous. You're standing here worried about your numbers while an 80-year-old woman sits outside your building with nowhere to sleep tonight. Richard flinched, and for the first time since Tommy had entered the office, something like genuine shame flickered across his face, not manufactured, not performed for effect, but real, uncomfortable, unwelcome shame that he clearly hadn't expected to feel. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, Richard said, his voice quieter now, less defensive and more exhausted. Corporate sets impossible targets. Every quarter they want higher occupancy, faster turnover, fewer delinquent accounts. If I don't hit those numbers, I lose my position. I have a mortgage. I have a family. So did Martha Higgins, Tommy said. Except her mortgage was already paid off 30 years ago, and her family is mostly gone. And the one thing she had left in this world was that apartment, and you took it from her in an afternoon because a spreadsheet told you to. Richard sat down heavily in his chair, running both hands through his hair, and for a long moment neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. What do you actually want from me? Richard finally asked, his voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier corporate polish. I told you, Tommy said, reverse the eviction tonight, restore her lease. And I want it in writing signed by you personally that her rent is locked at its current rate for the rest of her life, with no future increases, no future disputes, nothing. She lived in that building peacefully for 30 years. She's going to live there peacefully for the rest of her life, or you're going to have a very serious problem on your hands. I can't guarantee lifetime rent freezes, Richard said. That's not within my authority. But corporate would never approve. Then get corporate on the phone, Tommy said. Right now, tell them exactly what happened today. Tell them there are 40 motorcycles outside your building and a story that's about to reach every local news station in the city unless this gets fixed tonight. See how quickly your regional director finds the authority to approve it. Richard stared at him for a long moment, weighing something behind his eyes. Then slowly he reached for his phone. If I do this, he said quietly, if I actually reverse this and lock in her rent, does this end? Do you and your club actually leave? The second Martha Higgins has her key back in her hand and a signed document guaranteeing her home for life. Tommy said, we're gone. You'll never see any of us again, unless, of course, you ever try something like this again. Then you'll see all of us and a lot more besides. Richard swallowed hard, his fingers hovering over his phone screen. And if I refuse? Tommy leaned forward again, his voice dropping to something quiet and absolutely certain. Then you're going to spend the rest of your career explaining to every journalist who calls exactly why 40 Hells Angels camped outside your building for a week straight. You're going to spend the rest of your career watching your occupancy rates crater because nobody wants to rent from a company that throws grandmothers onto the street. And every single time you close your eyes at night, you're going to see her face the face of a woman who never did anything wrong except grow old in a system that decided old people are inconvenient. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he dialed a number, pressing the phone to his ear. Downstairs, Martha sat in the passenger seat of the truck, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring up at the glass tower with an anxiety that refused to settle. Doris sat beside her, gripping her hand, while outside the truck window, 40 bikers stood in patient, silent formation, their presence alone a wall of protection against a world that had tried just hours earlier to erase an old woman entirely. How long has he been up there? Doris asked. Almost 15 minutes, Martha said quietly. He said 5. Sal appeared at the truck window, his massive frame blocking out most of the remaining evening light. Don't worry, ma'am. Tommy's patient when he needs to be. If it's taking longer, it just means the man up there is being stubborn, and Tommy's making sure he understands exactly how this is going to go. What if it doesn't work? Martha whispered. What if he refuses? What if this was all for nothing and I still have nowhere to live tonight? Sal's expression softened. Ma'am, in 15 years of riding with Tommy Graham, I've seen him talk grown men into doing things they swore they'd never do. Not through threats, through truth. He's got a way of making people see themselves clearly, sometimes for the first time in their whole lives. That man up there is about to see himself clearer than he has in 15 years of climbing some corporate ladder. As if summoned by Sal's words, movement flickered in one of the 15th floor windows. Martha's breath caught as she watched two silhouettes, one unmistakably, Tommy's broad frame, the other smaller, hunched, pacing anxiously with a phone pressed to his ear. Is that them? Doris asked, following Martha's gaze upward. That's them, Martha confirmed, her heart pounding. No. Inside the office, Richard paced the length of his desk phone, pressed tight against his ear, waiting through an agonizing series of rings before his regional director, Patricia Wembley, finally answered. Richard, it's Saturday evening. This had better be important. Patricia, I have a situation, Richard said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. The Higgins eviction from this morning, the Sycamore Street property, there's a complication. What kind of complication? Richard glanced at Tommy, who stood silently by the window, arms crossed, watching him with an expression of patient, unwavering expectation. There are approximately 40 motorcycles parked outside the building right now, Richard said, belonging to a motorcycle club. They're insisting we reverse the eviction and lock her rent permanently, or they're threatening to make this public. Media review cites the whole situation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. 40 motorcycles, Patricia repeated slowly. Richard, are you telling me we have a biker gang staging some kind of protest outside a company property? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Have you called the police? Richard glanced at Tommy again, who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but whose stillness carried more weight than any threat could have. I don't think that's going to resolve this situation favorably, Patricia. I think we need to consider fixing the underlying error instead. The underlying error, Patricia repeated, her voice sharpening. Richard, are you suggesting we cave to intimidation from a criminal organization? Tommy, who had clearly heard enough through the phone's speaker, stepped forward and extended his hand toward Richard. May I? Richard hesitated, then with visible reluctance handed over the phone. Ma'am, Tommy said into the receiver, his voice calm and measured. My name is Tommy Graham. I'm the president of the Riverside chapter of the Hells Angels. I want to be very clear with you about what's happening here because I think there's some confusion about this situation. There was stunned silence on the other end of the line. Your employee evicted an 80-year-old widow this afternoon, Tommy continued, over a payment discrepancy that your own bank has already confirmed was not her error. Her own building employee, your receptionist, flagged the issue as suspicious this morning and was told it wasn't her department. That woman had 30 years of perfect rent history. 30 years. And this afternoon, she found herself sitting on a curb with everything she owns in cardboard boxes because your company decided speed was more important than accuracy. Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but threatening my employee. I haven't threatened anyone, Tommy said, his voice remaining perfectly level. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't laid a hand on a single person tonight. What I have done is bring 40 witnesses to stand outside your building and watch what happens next. Because here's the thing, ma'am. This story is already true. It already happened. The only question left is whether your company fixes it quietly tonight, or whether it becomes a story that every local news station picks up tomorrow morning, complete with footage of 40 motorcycles surrounding your building and an 80-year-old widow explaining exactly what your company did to her. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Tommy wondered if the call had dropped. What exactly are you asking for? Patricia finally said, her voice noticeably less combative. Full reversal of the eviction effective immediately, Tommy said. Restoration of her original lease, waiver of any fabricated late fees or penalties, and a written signed guarantee that her rent remains locked at its current rate for the remainder of her tenancy with no future disputes over payment history, regardless of what your portal system claims in the future. That's an unusual request, Patricia said slowly. It's an unusual situation, Tommy replied. Your company nearly destroyed a woman's entire life over an error that took less than an hour to disprove once someone actually looked at her bank statements. I'd say the request is more than reasonable given the circumstances. Another long pause. Tommy waited patient as ever while Richard stood beside his desk, wringing his hands. watching the entire negotiation unfold with an expression somewhere between terror and disbelief. "Put Richard back on," Patricia finally said. Tommy handed the phone back without a word. "Patricia," Richard said, his voice tight. There was a rapid exchange on the other end that Tommy couldn't fully hear, but he watched Richard's face shift through several expressions in quick succession: fear, relief, something that looked almost like humiliation, before Richard finally nodded and set the phone down on his desk, ending the call. "Well?" Tommy asked. Richard exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. "She's approved it. Full reversal effective immediately. She's authorized me to draft the amended lease with the rent freeze written in." Something in Tommy's chest loosened for the first time since he'd stepped off his motorcycle outside this building. "She also said," Richard added quietly, "that this needs to be handled discreetly. No press, no public statements from either side." "That's fine," Tommy said. "We're not interested in publicity. We're interested in Martha Higgins getting her home back." Richard sat down at his desk, pulling up his computer, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the particular unsteadiness of a man doing something he genuinely didn't want to do, but no longer had any way to avoid. Tommy watched him work in silence, and for the first time since entering the office, allowed himself a small measure of relief. But relief, Tommy had learned long ago, was a dangerous thing to feel too soon. "There's something else," Richard said, not looking up from his screen. Tommy's stomach tightened. "What?" Richard hesitated, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. "The lease reversal, I can process that tonight, no problem. But the rent freeze, the lifetime guarantee, that requires a formal amendment that has to be notarized. I can draft it tonight, but I can't have it properly executed until Monday morning when the notary service opens." "So what exactly are you saying?" Tommy asked, his voice going carefully flat. "I'm saying the eviction reversal happens tonight," Richard said. "She gets her key back tonight. But the legal guarantee on her rent, the part that actually protects her long-term, that can't be finalized until Monday." Tommy studied him carefully, searching for the lie he was certain must be hiding somewhere in that explanation. But Richard's face carried none of the smooth, practiced coldness from that morning. Instead, it carried something closer to genuine anxiety, the anxiety of a man caught between two forces far more powerful than himself, desperately trying to satisfy both without losing everything. "You understand," Tommy said slowly, "that if Monday comes and goes and that document isn't signed, I'm coming back. And next time, I won't be nearly as patient." "I understand," Richard said quietly. "I'll have it ready first thing Monday morning. You have my word." "Your word," Tommy repeated, something bitter in his voice. "This morning your word evicted an innocent woman over a computer glitch. Forgive me if I don't find your word particularly reassuring." Richard flinched, and for a long moment, silence filled the office again. "I'll be there myself," Richard finally said. "Monday morning first thing. I'll personally deliver the signed notarized document to her apartment. You have my word on that too, and I understand if that means nothing to you right now. But I'm going to prove it anyway." Tommy studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against 15 years of corporate training that had taught this man to say whatever needed saying to make a problem disappear. "Monday morning," Tommy said finally. "First thing. If you're not there, if that document isn't signed, you're going to learn exactly how patient 40 motorcycles can be parked outside your building for as long as it takes." "Understood," Richard said. Tommy turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at the man behind the desk, a man who just hours earlier had dismissed an 80-year-old widow's entire life as an inconvenience, and who now sat visibly shaken, genuinely uncertain of his own footing for what might have been the first time in his career. "Can I tell you something?" Tommy asked. Richard looked up wary. "What? The woman you evicted this morning saved my life when I was 16 years old," Tommy said. "Not metaphorically, actually saved it. My own father would have killed me if she hadn't opened her door to a stranger's kid on the worst night of my life. She didn't know me. She didn't owe me anything. She just saw a person who needed help, and she helped him without asking what she'd get in return." Richard said nothing, watching him. "You had the exact same choice this morning," Tommy continued. "You saw a person who needed a little patience, a little humanity, a little willingness to double-check a system before destroying someone's life over it. And you chose the easy path instead. The fast path. The path that let you hit your numbers without slowing down to see the human being standing in front of you." I know, Richard said quietly, and for the first time it sounded like he actually meant it. Then remember this feeling, Tommy said, gesturing toward the window, toward the sea of motorcycles waiting patiently below. Remember exactly what it feels like to have the ground shift under you because you chose convenience over compassion. Because the next time you're sitting at your desk deciding whether some other tenant's life matters more than your quarterly numbers, I want you to remember tonight. I want you to remember Martha Higgins, and I want you to make a different choice. He walked out of the office without waiting for a response, leaving Richard Caldwell alone at his desk, staring at a half-finished lease amendment glowing on his monitor, and feeling for the first time in 15 years of climbing a corporate ladder built on other people's misfortune, something that felt uncomfortably, undeniably like shame. When the elevator doors opened onto the lobby, Tommy found Martha standing just inside the glass doors, having been let in by Jennifer while she waited anxiously for news. Her eyes found his, immediately searching his face for any sign of what had happened upstairs. "Well?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tommy crossed the lobby in a few long strides and took both her hands in his, the same way he had on the sidewalk hours earlier. "You're getting your home back tonight," he said. "Full reversal. Your lease is restored effective right now." Martha's knees buckled slightly, and Tommy caught her, steadying her gently as tears began streaming down her face for what felt like the 100th time that day, though these tears carried an entirely different weight than the ones that had come before. "Tonight," she whispered. "I can go home tonight." "Tonight," Tommy confirmed, "and Monday morning that man is bringing you a signed, notarized document guaranteeing your rent stays exactly where it is for the rest of your life. No more surprises, no more portal errors, no more anyone deciding your home is negotiable." Behind them, the glass doors opened as Sal and several other riders stepped inside, drawn by the sight of Martha's tears, uncertain whether to celebrate or brace for bad news until they saw the relief written plainly across her face. "She's going home," Tommy announced, and the words rippled through the assembled riders like a current of electricity. 40 men who had spent the last hours standing in patient, silent formation, suddenly breaking into quiet, satisfied murmurs of approval. Doris, who had been waiting anxiously outside, pushed through the glass doors the moment she heard the commotion, immediately wrapping Martha in a fierce embrace. "You're going home," Doris said, half laughing, half crying. "Martha, you're actually going home." "Tonight," Martha confirmed, still barely believing the words herself. "I'm going home tonight." Tommy watched the two old friends embrace, watched 40 hardened bikers wipe suspiciously damp eyes while pretending they weren't affected at all, and felt something settle in his own chest that had been unsettled for 30 long years, the particular hard-won peace that comes from finally repaying a debt that had once felt impossible to repay. But even as relief washed through the lobby, Tommy's mind remained fixed on one uncomfortable detail, one loose thread that refused to let him fully relax. Monday morning, first thing. If Richard Caldwell's word turned out to be worth exactly as much as it had been worth that morning at Martha's door, this fight was far from finished. And Tommy Graham had absolutely no intention of letting Martha Higgins' home slip through her fingers a second time. The key felt strange in Martha's hand, heavier than it had that morning, though it was the exact same key she had carried for 30 years. Jennifer had produced a spare from the office records, apologizing 3 times as she handed it over, and Martha closed her fingers around it like it was something precious enough to shatter. "I still can't believe it. This is real," she said, standing in the lobby with Tommy on one side and Doris on the other, 40 bikers filling the space around them with a warmth that felt almost impossible given how the day had started. "Believe it," Tommy said. "Let's get you home." The ride back to Sycamore Street felt entirely different from the ride that had brought her here. Martha sat behind Tommy again, her arms wrapped around his waist. And this time the wind against her face didn't feel like fear or exhilaration. It felt like relief, pure and simple, the particular relief of a woman returning to a life she thought she'd lost forever. When the convoy rolled back onto her street, neighbors who had watched the eviction that morning came out onto their porches again, this time witnessing something entirely different. They watched 40 motorcycles escort an old woman home, watched grown men carry cardboard boxes back up the same steps they had carried them down hours earlier, watched a young couple 2 doors down pause their own unpacking to stare in open astonishment at the sight unfolding in front of them. Doris's neighbor from the 3rd floor, a retired school teacher named Eleanor, who rarely left her apartment except for grocery runs, stood on her balcony with her hand pressed over her heart, tears streaming freely down her face as she watched Martha climb the front steps of the building, key in hand, flanked by 24 leather-clad men treating cardboard boxes like they contained fragile treasure. "Careful with that one," Tommy instructed Sal, pointing at a box marked in Martha's careful handwriting. "That's got her photographs in it." "Already on it, Prez," Sal said, cradling the box like it weighed nothing at all, though his enormous frame made even the heaviest items look effortless. Martha stood at her apartment door, apartment 2B, the same door that had been forced open by a locksmith's drill just hours earlier, and stared at the freshly changed deadbolt with an expression that mixed disbelief and something close to grief for the violation the door itself represented. "They changed the lock," she said quietly. "Even if I get the apartment back, this isn't even the same lock anymore." Tommy stepped forward, examining the mechanism with the practiced eye of a man who had learned over decades of hard living a little bit about everything mechanical. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. "I know a locksmith who owes me a favor from about 15 years back. He'll have this fixed before you even finish unpacking your first box." True to his word, within 20 minutes an older man arrived carrying a toolbox, greeting Tommy with the particular warmth of someone who remembered exactly what debt he was repaying and was glad for the chance to finally settle it. He worked quickly and efficiently, restoring the original lock mechanism with a new key that Martha could finally truly call her own again. "There you go, ma'am," the locksmith said, handing her the new key with a gentle smile. "Nobody's changing this one without your say-so ever again." Martha took the key with trembling hands, closing her fingers around it as though she were holding something alive. By the time the last box had been carried inside and arranged roughly back into place, the evening had deepened into full darkness, streetlights casting warm pools of light along Sycamore Street, where 40 motorcycles sat parked in neat, orderly rows. Martha stood in the center of her living room, surrounded by boxes she hadn't yet found the energy to unpack, staring at the photographs Sal had carefully unwrapped and placed back on her coffee table. Walter in his army uniform. Her wedding day. Daniel's childhood captured in fading color. And there on top of the small stack, the photograph of a thin, frightened 16-year-old boy standing awkwardly in this very kitchen 31 years earlier. Tommy noticed her staring at it and walked over, picking up the photograph, carefully studying his own younger face with an expression that mixed nostalgia and something far more complicated. "I remember the day you took this," he said softly. "You said you wanted proof that I existed in case I ever doubted it myself. You looked so scared," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "I remember thinking, what kind of world does this to a child? The same kind of world that throws 80-year-old widows onto the street because a computer made a mistake nobody bothered to check," Tommy said quietly. "Some things don't change as much as we'd like to believe." Martha reached out and took the photograph from his hands, holding it against her chest for a moment before setting it carefully back down among the others. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I don't have words big enough for what you did today." "You don't need words," Tommy said. "You already gave me everything I needed 30 years ago. Tonight was just me finally getting the chance to say thank you properly." Doris, who had been quietly organizing kitchen items back into their proper cabinets, looked up with a soft smile. "You two have quite a story," she said. 30 years, and it comes back around exactly when it's needed most." "That's usually how these things work," Sal said from the doorway, where he'd been supervising the last of the unloading. "The debts that matter most, they don't disappear just because time passes. They just wait." It was nearly 9 o'clock when the last of the club finally prepared to leave, engines beginning to rumble back to life one by one along the quiet street. Tommy lingered behind, standing in Martha's doorway, watching her settle slowly into her favorite chair by the window, the same chair where she had sat that very morning, drinking coffee from her chipped blue mug, utterly unaware of the chaos the day would bring. "You're really going to want to stay here tonight?" Tommy asked. "After everything that happened, you're sure you don't want to come stay with me just for tonight, just to be safe?" "I've spent 30 years in this apartment, Tommy," Martha said, looking around at her restored home with an expression of profound, exhausted gratitude. "I think I'll sleep better here tonight than anywhere else in the world." Tommy nodded slowly, though something in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. "I'm posting someone outside tonight," he said, "just as a precaution, in case that man decides to try something before Monday morning." "Tommy, that's really not necessary." It's absolutely necessary, Tommy said firmly in a tone that reminded Martha briefly of the authority he must carry every day as the president of his club. I'm not taking any chances with your safety, Miss Martha. Not tonight, not ever again. Martha studied his face and recognized underneath the leather and the tattoos and the 30 years of hardened living the same protective fierceness that had first driven a broken 16-year-old boy to promise on her porch steps that he would come running if she ever needed him. All right, she said softly, if it makes you feel better. It does, Tommy said. He crouched down beside her chair, taking her hand one more time. I'll be back Monday morning. I want to be here when Caldwell brings that paperwork, just to make sure everything's exactly as it should be. You don't have to do that. You've already done so much. Miss Martha Bowsteppen. Tommy said, his voice softening into something almost boyish despite his weathered face. I spent 30 years wishing I had a way to pay you back for what you did for me. I'm not stopping now just because tonight went well. This isn't finished until that lease is signed, sealed, and guaranteed for the rest of your life. I promised you that, and I keep my promises. Martha squeezed his hand, tears welling in her eyes again, though these tears, unlike the ones from that morning, carried nothing but gratitude. Get some rest, Tommy said, standing up. Everything's going to be fine now. He left her apartment with one final glance back, watching her settle into her chair, safe within walls that were for the first time all day truly and completely hers again. Sunday passed in a strange, quiet limbo. Martha spent the morning slowly unpacking boxes, pausing frequently to simply sit and absorb the reality that she was home, truly home, with her photographs back on the walls and her chipped blue mug back in its cabinet. Doris visited twice, once in the morning with a casserole and once in the afternoon simply to sit together in comfortable silence, both women still processing the whirlwind of the previous day. Outside, exactly as Tommy had promised, a rotating pair of bikers kept quiet watch from a parked truck across the street, present but unobtrusive, a silent guarantee that nothing would disturb Martha's peace before Monday's final resolution. But peace, as Martha had learned many times throughout her long life, rarely lasted without challenge. Sunday evening, just as the sun began its slow descent, Martha's phone rang, not the ancient flip phone Doris had lent her, but her own old landline, a number that hadn't rung in months. Hello, Martha answered, cautious after the events of the previous day. Mrs. Higgins, a young man's voice asked, unfamiliar and hesitant. This is Kevin from Oakleaf's corporate customer service. We spoke yesterday about your account. Martha's stomach tightened. Yes, I remember. I wanted to call because, well, I heard through some channels that your eviction situation is being resolved, Kevin said carefully. But I also wanted to warn you about something, and I'm probably not supposed to be telling you this, so please don't mention my name if this comes up. What is it, Kevin? There's talk in the regional office, Kevin said, his voice dropping lower, as though worried about being overheard even now. Talk that some people higher up than Mr. Caldwell aren't happy about how this got resolved, about how it looked like the company caved to intimidation. I heard someone mention potentially challenging the agreement legally, arguing it was signed under duress. Martha's blood ran cold. Under duress, but Mr. Caldwell agreed to fix his own mistake. I know, Kevin said. I know it's not fair. I just wanted you to have a heads up in case anything changes tomorrow. I really am sorry, Mrs. Higgins, for all of this. The call ended, leaving Martha sitting alone in her restored apartment, staring at her freshly hung photographs, with a fresh wave of anxiety twisting in her stomach. She reached immediately for the flip phone Doris had left with her, dialing Tommy's number with shaking hands. He picked up on the second ring. Miss Martha, everything all right? Tommy, I just got a strange call, she said, her voice trembling as she relayed everything Kevin had told her. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Martha could practically hear Tommy's jaw tightening through the silence. They're not backing out, Tommy said finally, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Not after everything. I don't care what excuse they try to hide behind. What if they do, though? What if this Monday morning meeting turns into something else entirely? What if Richard shows up with lawyers instead of paperwork? Then he'll find out real quick that lawyers don't scare me any more than corporate policy does, Tommy said. Miss Martha, listen to me carefully. I'm coming back first thing tomorrow morning, same as promised. And I'm not coming alone. Whatever they're planning, we'll be ready for it. Tommy, I don't want anyone getting hurt over this. Nobody's getting hurt, Tommy said firmly. But I'm also not letting that man walk back his word just because some suit in a corner office decided caving to basic human decency looked bad on a quarterly report. You just try to get some rest tonight. I'll handle the rest. Martha hung up the phone, her heart still pounding, staring out at the darkened street where she could just make out the shape of the truck parked across the road. Its silent occupants a reminder that whatever happened tomorrow, she would not be facing it alone. Monday morning arrived gray and overcast, the kind of morning that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of something significant. Martha woke early as always, making her coffee in her chipped blue mug, sitting in her chair by the window, watching the street below, with an anxiety she hadn't felt since the morning of the eviction itself. At 8:15, motorcycles began arriving, not 40 this time, but a smaller, more focused contingent, perhaps a dozen riders led by Tommy himself parking along the street with the same disciplined precision as before. At 8:30, a black sedan pulled up behind them. Martha watched from her window as Richard Caldwell stepped out of his car carrying a leather folder that looked remarkably similar to the one he'd carried into her apartment 2 days earlier, though this time something in his posture seemed different, less rigid, less certain of his own authority. Beside him stepped a woman in an expensive gray suit, her expression carefully neutral, carrying her own folder and radiating the particular coldness of someone whose entire job existed to manage risk and liability. Martha's stomach dropped. Whoever this woman was, she didn't look like someone who had come to celebrate a happy resolution. She hurried downstairs as quickly as her knees would allow, arriving in the building's lobby just as Tommy and several riders entered from the opposite direction, meeting Richard and the unknown woman in a tense standoff that immediately filled the small space with palpable pressure. "Mrs. Higgins," Richard said, his eyes flicking nervously toward the woman beside him before returning to Martha. "This is Patricia Wembley, our regional director. She wanted to be present for the finalization of your lease amendment." Patricia extended a hand that Martha shook cautiously, sensing immediately that this woman's presence carried far more weight than a simple courtesy visit. "Mrs. Higgins," Patricia said, her voice smooth and professionally warm in a way that immediately reminded Martha of Richard's own manner 2 mornings earlier, polished, careful, and utterly without genuine feeling. "I wanted to personally ensure this situation was handled appropriately. There's been quite a bit of internal discussion about Friday's events." Tommy stepped forward, immediately positioning himself protectively beside Martha. "What kind of discussion?" Patricia's eyes moved to him, assessing him with the same old calculation Martha remembered from Richard's initial visit. "You must be Mr. Graham. I understand you're the one responsible for organizing Friday's demonstration. I'm the one responsible for making sure an 80-year-old woman didn't spend the night on the street because your company made a mistake it refused to correct." Tommy said, his voice carrying an edge that made Patricia's practiced smile falter slightly. "Be that as it may," Patricia continued, recovering quickly, "our legal department has raised some concerns about the circumstances under which Mr. Caldwell agreed to the terms discussed Friday evening. Specifically concerns about whether an agreement made under the presence of 40 armed motorcycle gang members constitutes a legally binding contract, or whether it might be characterized as an agreement obtained under duress." The lobby went completely silent. Martha felt her legs weaken beneath her, and Doris, who had followed her downstairs just moments earlier, gripped her arm tightly for support. "Are you telling me," Tommy said slowly, each word carrying weight like stones being placed deliberately on a scale, "that you drove here this morning to tell an 80-year-old widow that your company is reconsidering fixing its own mistake?" "I'm telling you," Patricia said, her voice remaining carefully neutral, "that we need to explore alternative resolutions that don't expose the company to claims of having negotiated under intimidation." "There was no intimidation," Martha said suddenly, her voice trembling, but firm, surprising everyone in the lobby, including herself. "Nobody threatened anyone. Nobody raised a hand. 40 men stood outside your building in complete silence and waited for a conversation to happen. That's not intimidation. That's what happens when a community shows up to support someone who's been wronged." Patricia's carefully composed expression flickered slightly clearly, not expecting pushback from the elderly woman she had assumed would remain silent and grateful. "Mrs. Higgins, I understand this is emotional for you." "Don't," Martha said, her voice suddenly sharp, carrying the same fire that had briefly surfaced during her first confrontation with Richard 2 days earlier. "Don't you dare talk down to me like I'm some confused old woman who doesn't understand what happened to her. I understand perfectly well what happened. Your company made an error. Your own employee identified that error before the eviction even occurred. And instead of correcting a mistake that took less than an hour to verify, your company chose to throw me out of my home of 30 years because checking would have slowed down your process. Patricia's mouth opened, then closed, clearly unprepared for the force behind Martha's words. And now, Martha continued, drawing herself up to her full height despite her exhaustion. Instead of simply admitting that mistake and fixing it, you're standing here in my lobby suggesting that the only reason your company agreed to correct its own error was intimidation rather than basic human decency, finally winning out over corporate convenience. Is that really the story you want to tell, Ms. Wembley? That your company only does the right thing when frightened into it, and reverses course the moment it thinks it can get away with cruelty again? The lobby fell into stunned silence. Even Tommy, who had spent 30 years admiring Martha's quiet strength, found himself momentarily speechless at the fire blazing behind her tired eyes. Patricia stood frozen for a long moment, clearly recalculating her entire approach in real time. Behind her, Richard shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the two women with visible discomfort. "Mrs. Higgins," Patricia finally said, her voice noticeably less confident than moments earlier. "I understand your frustration, but you have to understand our position as well. If this becomes public knowledge, if it becomes known that we reversed a legitimate business decision because of intimidation from a motorcycle gang, it sets a dangerous precedent. Other tenants might expect similar treatment. Other groups might use similar tactics." "Then don't call it intimidation," Tommy said quietly. "Call it what it actually was. A community standing up for one of its own after your company failed to show basic decency. Call it accountability, because that's exactly what it was." Patricia turned to look at him, and for a moment, something calculating flickered behind her professionally neutral expression. "Mr. Graham, I have another proposal," she said slowly. "One that might resolve this situation in a way that protects everyone's interests." Martha's stomach tightened with fresh anxiety. "What kind of proposal?" "We're prepared to offer Mrs. Higgins a generous relocation package," Patricia said. "A different unit, perhaps, in one of our newer properties across town, along with financial compensation for the inconvenience of Friday's events. This would allow us to resolve the situation quietly without setting the precedent of appearing to cave to pressure regarding this specific unit." Martha stared at her, understanding immediately what was actually being proposed. Not a genuine resolution, but a corporate maneuver designed to save face while still ultimately removing her from the home she had lived in for 30 years. "You want to move me," Martha said slowly, "so it doesn't look like you backed down." "We want to offer you an improved living situation," Patricia corrected smoothly, while also protecting the company's ability to maintain consistent policy enforcement across all our properties. "I don't want a different unit," Martha said, her voice hardening. "I want my home. The one with 30 years of memories in every corner. The one where my husband's photograph hangs exactly where he would have wanted it. The one where I raised my son and said goodbye to my husband and welcomed a frightened teenage boy into my kitchen 31 years ago. You cannot replace 30 years of a life with a different unit and a check, Ms. Wembley. That's not compensation. That's erasure with a nicer word attached to it." The lobby fell silent again, and this time even Patricia seemed unable to find an immediate response. Tommy stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You came here today looking for a way to save your company's reputation without actually admitting fault. I understand that. Corporations do that every single day, and most of the time nobody stops to notice or care. But today you're standing in front of the exact person your policy hurt, and she just told you in plain terms that a different apartment and a check don't fix what your company broke. So here's what happens next." Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what exactly is that, Mr. Graham?" "You're going to honor the original agreement," Tommy said. "Full reversal, restored lease, exact same unit. Rent locked at current rate for life, in writing, notarized exactly as promised Friday night. And you're going to do it not because 40 motorcycles are outside your building right now, though they are, but because it's the right thing to do, and because you already know deep down that it's the right thing to do." "And if we refuse," Patricia asked, though her voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. "Then I make one phone call," Tommy said calmly, "to a reporter I happen to know at Channel 7 who's always looking for stories about corporate accountability. And I tell her exactly what happened here today, how your company reversed an unjust eviction under public pressure, only to try walking it back 2 days later by offering a bribe disguised as compensation, specifically so it wouldn't look like accountability actually worked. I imagine that story writes itself, don't you? Patricia's jaw tightened visibly. For a long, tense moment, nobody in the lobby spoke, the silence stretching taut with the weight of everything hanging in the balance. Finally, Patricia turned to Richard, her expression unreadable. Draft the amendment, exactly as originally discussed. Have it notarized today. Richard, who had remained largely silent throughout the entire confrontation, nodded quickly at visible relief washing across his features. Yes, right away. Patricia turned back to Martha, her professional mask sliding back into place, though something underneath it now seemed slightly less certain than before. Mrs. Higgins, I apologize for any additional distress this morning's conversation may have caused. We'll have your paperwork finalized within the hour. Thank you, Martha said simply, though her voice carried none of the warmth typically associated with gratitude. Patricia turned and walked briskly toward the exit without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the lobby floor, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unresolved tension. Richard lingered for a moment, watching her go, before turning back to Martha with an expression that seemed for the first time since this entire ordeal began genuinely apologetic. Mrs. Higgins, he said quietly, I am sorry. For all of it. Friday and now this morning too. You didn't deserve any of this. Martha studied his face for a long moment, searching for the same cold efficiency she'd encountered 2 days earlier, but finding instead something that looked remarkably like genuine remorse. I believe you, she finally said. Now go get my paperwork done properly, Mr. Caldwell, and then let's both move forward from this. Richard nodded and hurried out, leaving Martha standing in her lobby, surrounded by Tommy's protective presence and Doris's steady support, breathing out a long, shaking exhale that carried with it 2 full days of accumulated fear. The notary arrived within the hour, and Richard returned precisely as promised, carrying a properly executed lease amendment that guaranteed in clear and unambiguous legal language that Martha Higgins would retain her apartment at her current rental rate for the remainder of her tenancy, with all previous penalties waived and her original lease fully restored. Martha signed her name with a hand that trembled slightly, though whether from exhaustion or overwhelming relief, she couldn't quite tell. Richard signed beside her, and the notary stamped the document with an official seal that made the entire agreement finally and completely legally unbreakable. It's done, Richard said quietly, sliding a copy across the small table set up in the building's lobby. Your home is yours, Mrs. Higgins, officially, permanently, and without any conditions that could ever be used against you again. Martha held the document in both hands, staring at it with an expression that mixed exhaustion and profound relief in equal measure. Thank you, she said softly. Richard nodded, gathering his own copy, and for a moment seemed uncertain whether to say anything further. Finally, he simply extended his hand. I hope you have many more years in that apartment, Mrs. Higgins, he said. I mean that sincerely. Martha shook his hand, studying his face one final time, searching for any remaining trace of the cold efficiency that had walked into her apartment 2 mornings earlier. What she found instead was a man who seemed for the first time genuinely humbled by the consequences of his own choices. Take care of yourself, Mr. Caldwell, she said, and take better care of the people whose lives you hold in your hands every day. Not everyone has a Tommy Graham to call when things go wrong. Richard's eyes flickered toward Tommy, standing quietly nearby, and something like genuine understanding passed across his face. I'll remember that, he said quietly before gathering his things and walking out of the building for the final time. That evening, as the last of Tommy's men prepared to finally return to their regular lives, Martha stood on her front steps watching the small remaining group of motorcycles preparing to depart. Tommy lingered longest, standing beside her in the cooling evening air. Both of them quiet for a long moment, absorbing the enormity of everything that had happened over the past 3 days. I don't know how to thank you, Martha finally said. There aren't words big enough. You already thanked me 30 years ago, Tommy said, smiling gently. Every kindness you showed me back then, this is just interest finally being paid. And Martha reached up and touched his weathered face the same way she had when he was 16 and terrified and utterly alone in the world. You grew into an extraordinary man, Tommy Graham, she said. I hope you know that. I had a good teacher, Tommy replied, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. The best one I ever had. He climbed onto his motorcycle, pulling on his helmet, and paused one final time before starting the engine. You call me if you ever need anything else, he said. I mean that, Miss Martha, anything at all. I know you do, Martha said, smiling through fresh tears. You always have. Tommy started his engine, the sound rolling gently through the quiet evening air, and rode away down Sycamore Street with his remaining brothers following behind, leaving Martha standing alone on her front steps, home at last, safe at last, surrounded by 30 years of memories that no computer error and no corporate policy would ever be able to take from her again. But as she turned to walk back inside her restored apartment, closing her freshly repaired door behind her for the first peaceful night, in 3 long days, Martha couldn't quite shake a small, lingering unease, a quiet certainty that something about Richard Caldwell's apology, however genuine it had seemed in the moment, hadn't been the last chapter of this story after all. The unease Martha carried into that first peaceful night didn't fade with sleep. It followed her into the following week, quiet but persistent, the kind of feeling she had learned over 80 years of living never to fully dismiss. 3 days after the signing, Doris knocked on her door holding a folded newspaper, her expression tight with concern. Martha, you need to see this. Martha took the paper with hands that had finally stopped trembling over the past few days, only to feel them start again as she read the headline printed across the local business section. Oakleaf Management faces scrutiny after string of similar complaints. Beneath it, a smaller article detailed at least 6 other elderly tenants across 3 different Oakleaf properties who had experienced strikingly similar situations over the past 2 years. Sudden portal errors, aggressive eviction timelines, and little recourse once the process began. 6 other people, Martha whispered, sinking into her chair by the window. 6 other families went through escalating what I went through, and nobody came to help them. Do you think Richard did this to all of them? Doris asked. I don't know, Martha said slowly, but I think it's time somebody found out. She reached for her flip phone, dialing Tommy's number with a determination that surprised even herself. Miss Martha, Tommy answered on the second ring, his voice immediately alert. Everything all right? I need you to see something, Martha said. I think what happened to me might not have been an isolated mistake. Tommy arrived within the hour, reading the article twice before setting the newspaper down on Martha's coffee table with a grim expression that reminded her briefly of the fury she'd witnessed the night he first rode onto Sycamore Street. 6 families, he said quietly, over 2 years, all elderly, all long-term tenants, suddenly flagged for delinquency right before their properties came up for renovation cycles. You think this was deliberate? Martha asked. I think, Tommy said slowly, that a company doesn't accidentally target 6 elderly tenants across 3 properties using the exact same excuse right before renovating those units and relisting them at double the rent. That's not a computer glitch, Miss Martha. That's that's a pattern. Martha felt something cold settle in her stomach. You're saying Richard did this on purpose? To me, too. I'm saying somebody did, Tommy said. Whether it was Richard specifically, or whether he was just following orders from someone higher up who designed the whole scheme, I don't know yet. But I intend to find out. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the one he was looking for. I've got a friend who used to work in corporate real estate before she got sick of the industry and became an investigative journalist instead. If there's a pattern here, she'll find it faster than anybody else I know. 2 days later, journalist Angela Reyes sat in Martha's living room with a laptop open, having spent 48 hours digging through public records, tenant complaints, and property filings that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. It's worse than 6 families, Angela said grimly, turning her laptop screen toward Martha and Tommy. I found court filings, tenant board complaints, even a lawsuit that got quietly settled 2 years ago. Oakleaf has been running variations of this exact scheme across multiple properties for at least 4 years. Target long-term rent-controlled tenants, usually elderly, usually alone, usually without family nearby to advocate for them. Generate a fabricated delinquency through the payment portal. Push through an accelerated eviction before the tenant can mount a proper defense. Then renovate the unit and relist it at triple the original rent. Martha sat very still, processing the sheer scale of what she was hearing. How many people? At least 14 confirmed cases, Angela said. Possibly more, that never made it into public records because the tenants simply gave up and moved rather than fight. 14 people, Martha repeated, her voice hollow. 14 people who probably felt exactly the way I felt sitting on that curb, and nobody came to help most of them. That's about to change, Tommy said quietly. his jaw set with the same grim determination Martha remembered from the night he'd walked into Richard's office. "Angela, what do you need to run this story properly?" "Documentation," Angela said. "On-the-record testimony from affected tenants. And ideally something that proves this wasn't just isolated bad judgment from individual property managers, but an actual corporate strategy handed down from above." Martha looked at the newspaper still lying on her coffee table, then at Tommy, then finally at the photograph of a frightened 16-year-old boy still sitting among her restored belongings. "I want to help," she said firmly. "Whatever you need from me, I'll do it." Over the following 2 weeks, something remarkable began taking shape. Tommy's club, initially mobilized purely to protect one woman they considered family, gradually expanded their efforts to track down and support the other victims Angela had identified in her research. Sal personally drove 3 separate elderly tenants to interviews with Angela, patient and gentle with each of them, despite his imposing size, treating every fragile, frightened person he encountered with the exact same careful reverence he'd shown Martha's cardboard boxes weeks earlier. One by one, the stories emerged. An 83-year-old veteran named Frank Delaney, evicted 18 months earlier over a nearly identical portal error, now living in a cramped assisted living facility he couldn't afford, having lost the spacious apartment where he'd lived since returning from Vietnam. A widow named Constance Park, pushed out of her home of 22 years, now sharing a small apartment with her adult daughter because she had nowhere else to go. A retired teacher, a former factory worker, a disabled Korean War veteran, each story slightly different in its details, but identical in its underlying cruelty. "They picked people who couldn't fight back," Martha said one evening sitting with Tommy and Angela as they reviewed the growing collection of testimonies. "People who were alone, people who didn't have family checking in regularly or lawyers on retainer, or anyone who might notice something was wrong before it was too late." "That's exactly the point," Angela said grimly. "This wasn't random. Somebody designed this system specifically to target the most vulnerable tenants, because they knew those tenants were the least likely to successfully fight back." Tommy's fists clenched on the table. "Richard didn't design this alone. Somebody above him created this whole strategy." "I found something interesting," Angela said, pulling up a document on her laptop. "Internal emails obtained from a former Oakleaf employee who left the company 8 months ago after refusing to process what she called targeted terminations. She kept copies before she quit, worried something like this might eventually need proving." She turned the screen toward them, revealing an email chain between several corporate executives discussing quarterly renovation targets, specifically referencing portfolio optimization through accelerated turnover of legacy tenancies. "Legacy tenancies," Martha repeated bitterly. "That's what they called us. Not people. Legacy tenancies." "There's more," Angela said. "This email is from Patricia Wembley herself, sent to regional managers across the company, explicitly instructing them to identify long-term tenants in rent-controlled units and find administrative pathways to accelerate turnover." Tommy went completely still. "Patricia Wembley, the same woman who tried to convince you to accept a relocation package instead of honoring the original agreement." "The same one," Martha confirmed, her voice hardening with a fury she rarely allowed herself to feel. "This is enough," Angela said. "This is more than enough to run the story, and probably enough to trigger a serious legal investigation. But I need to give the company a chance to respond before publication. That's standard journalistic practice." "Give them the chance," Tommy said, "but make sure they understand exactly how much evidence you're sitting on before they decide how to respond." The story broke 3 days later, splashed across the front page of the city's largest newspaper, alongside an online expose that spread rapidly through social media. Corporate landlords systematically targeted elderly long-term tenants for profit, documents reveal. The article detailed in careful, meticulously sourced language the pattern Angela had uncovered. 14 confirmed cases, internal emails proving deliberate corporate strategy, and first-hand testimony from tenants whose lives had been upended by a scheme designed specifically to exploit their vulnerability. Martha's own story anchored the piece her photograph included, alongside a quote that Angela had asked permission to use directly. "I paid my rent faithfully for 30 years. I raised my family in that home. I helped a frightened teenage boy who had nowhere else to turn. And when a machine made an error that took less than an hour to disprove, I discovered that my 30 years of loyalty meant nothing to the people who profited from my home." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Local news stations picked up the story within hours. Tenant advocacy groups began organizing. City council members called for formal investigations into Oakleaf's practices. And within 48 hours, Patricia Wembley resigned from her position, though the company's official statement carefully avoided any admission of wrongdoing, citing only a desire to pursue new opportunities. "She's not getting away with a quiet resignation," Angela said, calling Martha with updates as the story continued developing. The city attorney's office has opened a formal investigation. There's talk of a class action lawsuit representing all 14 confirmed victims, possibly more, once other affected tenants come forward now that the story's public. "What about Richard?" Martha asked. "He's cooperating fully with investigators," Angela said. "Turns out he kept his own records too separate from what Patricia knew about. Emails where he pushed back against the accelerated timeline on your case, specifically warning his supervisors the payment discrepancy needed proper verification before proceeding. Those emails were overruled by Patricia directly." Martha sat with this information for a long moment, processing the complicated reality of a man who had in fact tried to slow down the process that ultimately hurt her, only to be overruled by someone with more power and less conscience. "He's not innocent," Martha finally said. "He still evicted me. He still said the word inconvenience like my whole life meant nothing, but maybe he's not quite the villain I thought he was that first morning." "Maybe not," Angela agreed, though I imagine that distinction matters very little to the 14 families who lost their homes either way. 2 weeks after the story broke, Martha received an unexpected visitor. Richard Caldwell stood on her doorstep dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him, without his usual leather folder, without the polished corporate armor that had defined their first encounter. "Mrs. Higgins," he said, his voice carrying none of its former coldness. "I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I wanted to speak with you directly if you are willing." Martha studied him for a long moment before stepping aside, allowing him into her apartment for the second time in his life, though this visit carried none of the danger of the first. "I resigned from Oakleaf yesterday," Richard said, sitting stiffly on the edge of her couch. "Not because I was forced to, because I couldn't keep working somewhere that treated human beings the way this company treated you and Frank and Constance and all the others. I should have refused the first time Patricia asked me to expedite your case without proper verification. I should have trusted my own instincts instead of following orders." "Why didn't you?" Martha asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own hands. "Because I convinced myself that following the rules meant I wasn't responsible for what happened to the people those rules hurt. I told myself I was just doing my job, that the system existed for reasons above my understanding, and my only responsibility was efficient execution." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "That was a lie I told myself for 15 years, Mrs. Higgins. Meeting you and everything that happened afterward finally forced me to stop believing it." "What will you do now?" Martha asked. "I'm not sure yet," Richard admitted. "I've been offered a position with a tenant advocacy nonprofit, ironically enough. Someone who read the article reached out, said they could use someone who understood exactly how these corporate systems get designed to exploit people precisely because I used to build them." Martha considered this for a long moment. "That would be a strange kind of redemption." "Strange," Richard agreed, "but maybe exactly the kind I need." He stood to leave, pausing at her door. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Higgins, I am sorry. Not the kind of sorry I said that morning when I was really just sorry for the inconvenience of having to deal with your resistance. I mean genuinely deeply sorry for the role I played in something that should never have happened to you or anyone else." Martha studied his face, searching for any remaining trace of the cold efficiency that had once defined him, finding instead something that looked remarkably like genuine transformation. "I believe you," she said quietly. "Go do some good with what you've learned, Mr. Caldwell. That's the only apology that actually matters now." The class action lawsuit settled 8 months later, resulting in significant compensation for all 14 confirmed victims in a court-mandated overhaul of Oakleaf's tenant management practices, including independent oversight of any future eviction proceedings involving long-term or elderly tenants. Frank Delaney used his settlement to move back into an apartment nearly identical to the one he'd lost, finally able to afford the difference in rent. Constance Park moved into a small house with her daughter, finally free from the cramped apartment that had never felt like home. Martha herself donated a significant portion of her own settlement to the tenant advocacy nonprofit where Richard now worked, specifically earmarking the funds for emergency legal assistance for elderly tenants facing similar situations in the future. You didn't have to do that, Tommy said one evening, sitting with her on her front porch as autumn leaves drifted down from the same maple tree she'd watched every October for 30 years. I know, Martha said, but I spent one afternoon sitting on a curb with nowhere to go, completely alone except for Doris and a stranger's kindness. I don't want anyone else to have to feel that alone again, not if I can help prevent it. Tommy smiled, the expression carrying none of the hardness that had once defined his approach to the world, replaced instead by something softer, something that had been growing steadily since the night he'd first climbed off his motorcycle outside her building. You know, he said, in 30 years I never once doubted that I owed you everything. But watching you turn what happened to you into something that protects other people, I think I finally understand exactly why you were the one person in this whole world who saw something worth saving in a broken 16-year-old boy nobody else wanted. Martha reached over and took his weathered hand in her frail one, the same gesture she'd offered him 3 decades earlier in this very building. You were never broken, Tommy, she said gently. You were just waiting for someone to remind you that you mattered. Everyone deserves that reminder sooner or later. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set over Sycamore Street, the same street where 40 motorcycles had once gathered in righteous fury, now quiet and peaceful home to an old woman who had learned that kindness offered freely decades earlier could return in exactly the moment it was needed most. Doris joined them, eventually bringing tea and settling into the third chair on the porch that had somehow over the following months become a permanent fixture of their weekly gatherings. Sal visited occasionally too, along with several other members of Tommy's club, transforming what had begun as a debt of gratitude into something that increasingly resembled an actual extended family, gathered together by circumstance and choice in equal measure. You know what I keep thinking about, Martha said one evening, months after the settlement, watching Tommy's grandchildren, the children of a young rider named Danny, who had married into the club years earlier, playing in her front yard while the adults talked quietly on the porch. How close I came to giving up that afternoon. How easy it would have been to simply accept what happened, to believe that an 80-year-old woman had no power against a corporation, and quietly disappear into whatever came next. But you didn't give up, Tommy said. You called me. I called you, Martha agreed, because 30 years ago I chose to believe that a frightened teenage boy deserved a chance nobody else was willing to give him. And that choice, made without any expectation of return, ended up saving my entire life decades later. She looked at Tommy with an expression of profound gratitude. That's the whole secret, isn't it? Kindness isn't an investment you make expecting returns. It's just who you choose to be, moment by moment, regardless of whether anyone ever repays it. Most people never get repaid, Tommy said quietly. Most kindness just disappears into the world unnoticed and unrewarded, and the person who offered it never knows what became of it. And yet the world keeps turning because people offer it anyway, Martha said. Because somewhere in a kitchen, much like this one, that another stranger will open a door to someone who desperately needs to be let in without knowing whether it will ever come back around. Tommy nodded slowly, watching the last light of the setting sun paint Sycamore Street in warm amber tones. The same street where his entire life had once changed course because one woman chose compassion over convenience. Miss Martha, he said finally, I think that's the truest thing anyone's ever said to me. They sat together as evening settled fully over the neighborhood, two people bound together by a debt that had finally completely been repaid, though neither of them would have described what existed between them in terms of debts anymore. What remained now was simply family, the kind built not from blood, but from the unbreakable bond of a kindness offered freely decades ago to a broken boy who grew into a man capable of moving mountains, and who never once forgot the woman who first taught him he was worth saving. Justice in the end hadn't come from courtrooms or legal proceedings, though those had eventually followed. It hadn't come from corporate policy or government regulation, though those too had finally belatedly arrived. Justice had come first, and most powerfully from something far simpler and far more enduring, from a promise made on a porch step 30 years earlier, honored completely when it mattered most, proving beyond any doubt that the debts of the heart, unlike the debts recorded in any portal or ledger, never truly expire and always eventually find their way home.